The Ford Zodiac began its life in the early 1950s as Ford of Britain's attempt to elevate the familiar Consul/Zephyr range into something more aspirational, something that could serve as an attainable luxury car for the upper middle class. Post-war Britain was recovering economically, and Ford sensed an evolving market. People wanted American-flavored styling, a feeling of modernity, and a car that didn't look ration-era frugal. The Zodiac answered that hunger. It stood above the Zephyr not just in price, but in presence: chrome embellishments, richer interiors, larger engines, and a carefully cultivated aura of prestige. For Ford, it was a symbolic move too. After years of conservative British automotive design, the Zodiac was intended to look bold by comparison, signaling that Ford UK was ready to push boundaries in style and comfort. The early Mark I Zodiac built its identity on its transatlantic cues. Rapid chrome sweeps, two-tone paintwork, white-wall tires, and a bigger straight six gave the car a kind of exported American glamour scaled down for British roads. It distinguished itself from the working-class image of Ford's previous models and carved out a clientele that wanted something extravagant without crossing into Rover or Jaguar territory. The press frequently commented on the Zodiac's unusual combination of affordability and prestige. It was a family car you could show off at the golf club. This balance helped the Zodiac become a cultural marker of 1950s optimism, appearing in newsreels, on television, and even in police service, lending it a public visibility that strengthened the badge's reputation. The Mark II, introduced in the mid-1950s, refined the recipe further. Its high-line and low-line facelifts, along with sleeker bodywork and more powerful drivetrains, allowed Ford to adapt the range to shifting consumer expectations. Britain was opening up socially and economically, and owning a Zodiac started to imply aspiration rather than ostentation. Ford deliberately marketed it as a car for people climbing the social ladder, with brochures showcasing its plush vinyl upholstery, extended boot, and advanced features such as overdrive. The Zodiac was not simply a larger Zephyr. It was marketed as a lifestyle upgrade. Dealers carefully maintained this distinction, helping the Zodiac's image remain aspirational yet attainable. However, as the 1950s ended, the Zodiac faced a growing set of competitors. Vauxhall's Cresta and Velox were encroaching on the same aspirational territory, while BMC was developing increasingly sophisticated saloons. The Zodiac still held a certain glamour, but its American-style looks were becoming less fashionable as the decade progressed. British tastes were shifting toward cleaner European lines, and consumers were paying more attention to engineering refinement rather than just visual appeal. Ford needed the next generation of the Zodiac to evolve stylistically and technically, and this pressure set the stage for model's dramatic reinvention with the Mark III. The Mark III Zodiac of the early 1960s was the car that redefined the nameplate and arguably represented its high point. With wider, lower proportions quad headlights and an aggressively modern silhouette, it finally shook off the last of its heavy 1950s visual language and stepped into a new decade with confidence. Ford worked hard to ensure the car felt genuinely premium inside. More space, better materials, and improved suspension geometry created a driving experience that many reviewers called almost continental. The Zodiac became a symbol of the early 60s British modernist moment, embracing crisp lines, confident proportions, and a sense of cosmopolitan sophistication. Yet, even as it succeeded, the seeds of future challenges were being planted. Competition was escalating, tastes were diversifying, and Ford's strategy would soon shift. The release of the Mark IV Zodiac in 1966 marked a major turning point for the badge, one that would ultimately influence its survival. Ford attempted a radical redesign, splitting the line into three distinct models: the Zephyr 4, Zephyr 6, and the new, more premium Zodiac. The company hoped to broaden the car's appeal by segmenting its audience more precisely, targeting budget-conscious buyers with the Zephyr while offering the Zodiac as a near-executive saloon. The result was a drastically enlarged car with bold, squared-off styling that reflected the mid-1960s American design zeitgeist more than the European trends gripping British and continental manufacturers. While the car made an instant visual impact, its sheer size and weight signaled a mismatch with the smaller, more efficient models that were gaining favor across Europe. Early reviews praised the interior room and imposing road presence, but were far more critical of the car's dynamics. The Mark IV suspension, despite its sophisticated independent rear setup, had a reputation for being unrefined. Steering feel was criticized, and the car seemed out of step with the increasingly nimble offerings from Rover, Triumph, Volvo, and even Fiat. Fuel economy was also a growing concern in a decade that saw a rising awareness of motoring costs. Ford had aimed for a big, grand, polished saloon, something akin to a budget American Boulevard cruiser, but the British public was leaning in the opposite direction, toward more efficient, more responsive, and more European-leaning machines. The Zodiac suddenly found itself out of sync with its audience. Another issue was manufacturing complexity. The Mark IV range, especially the Zodiac, was expensive for Ford to build. Its unique panels, upgraded interiors, and more advanced components increased production costs at a time when Ford was increasingly focused on global platform efficiency. The company was pivoting toward more unified vehicle architectures, wanting fewer bespoke national market models and more products that could be sold and built across regions. The Zodiac, with its heavily British identity and limited global sales potential, was becoming an anomaly within Ford's wider strategic plans. As Ford executives looked ahead to the 1970s, they saw less room for an upper-middle-class British saloon that didn't fit broader global trends. Meanwhile, competitors were innovating quickly. Rover's P6 was winning awards, Triumph's 2000 and 2500 were dynamically superior, and the Germans, BMW and Mercedes especially, were steadily luring wealthier British buyers with newfound availability and prestige. Even within Ford's own lineup, the Zodiac began to overlap uncomfortably with the emerging Cortina and soon-to-be-launched Granada. The Cortina was proving to be a runaway success, offering near-executive comfort in its higher trims at far lower cost. The Zodiac was simply losing its niche, no longer the inexpensive premium car of the 1950s, nor the modern, sharp contender of the early 1960s. It was drifting into an awkward identity crisis. By the late 1960s, the Mark IV Zodiac was still respected but no longer admired. It had a loyal customer base, but not a rapidly growing one. Sales declined steadily as buyers shifted to fresher, more efficient alternatives. Ford's attempts to give the car more prestige through trim upgrades and minor facelifts didn't significantly reverse the trend. Beneath the surface, Ford management was internally debating whether the Zodiac nameplate could survive into another generation. With the company's attention turning toward new, internationally viable models, the Zodiac's future was looking increasingly uncertain, even as it remained a familiar sight on British roads. The final years of the Ford Zodiac were shaped not by a single dramatic failure, but by several converging forces that gradually eroded its viability. As the 1970s approached, Ford was no longer willing to produce region-specific flagship models that lacked global synergy. The cost of designing and manufacturing a new Zodiac-class car, only for Britain and a handful of Commonwealth markets, were becoming impossible to justify. Ford of Europe had recently been established, combining British and German operations, and this new organizational structure prioritized shared platforms and shared engineering across countries. In this new era, the Zodiac simply didn't fit the plan. Its replacement, if it came, would need to be Europe-wide, and that meant the nameplate itself was likely doomed. Meanwhile, the Mark IV was aging rapidly. Its styling, once bold, now looked dated compared to the sleek, modern shapes emerging from Germany and Italy. Its mechanical flaws were well known, and even though the car was spacious and comfortable, it simply couldn't compete on dynamic sophistication. Buyers who once might have purchased a Zodiac increasingly found themselves looking to Rover P6, Triumph 2.5 Pi, BMW's new 5 Series predecessors, and eventually even Ford's own newer models. The Zodiac, once a beacon of British motoring ambition, was now an oversized relic of a fading design philosophy. Ford recognized this and quietly began to phase down investment in the line. As Ford Europe prepared its next generation of executive car, the company planned a clean break from the Zephyr/Zodiac lineage. This new model would be the Ford Granada, designed from the ground up as a pan-European saloon capable of competing directly with German and British rivals. The Granada would ultimately launch in 1972, effectively replacing both the Zephyr and the Zodiac in one sweeping motion. Its arrival rendered the Zodiac obsolete overnight. It offered more modern styling, contemporary engineering, better driving dynamics, and far broader market potential. The Granada's debut made it clear that Ford no longer needed the Zodiac name. Its future lay in unified branding and international models. The Zodiac's discontinuation wasn't accompanied by a grand farewell. The Mark IV quietly ended production in 1972, and Ford simply shifted promotional focus to the Granada without treating the outgoing car as a legacy model. Yet the Zodiac's historical significance remained intact. It had brought aspirational styling to post-war Britain, introduced many drivers to six-cylinder refinement, and helped establish Ford UK as a maker not just of working-class cars, but of middle and upper-middle-class saloons. The Zodiac had, for 2 decades, stood as a symbol of personal achievement, a car people bought when they felt they'd made it. Its departure marked the end of a distinctly British chapter in Ford's history. In the years since its demise, the Ford Zodiac has become a beloved classic among enthusiasts. Mark I and II models evoke 1950s optimism. Mark III models are prized for their clean modernist styling, and even the controversial Mark IV has gained respect for its uniqueness and imposing presence. While the Zodiac name never returned, its spirit continued in the Granada, the Scorpio, and eventually modern executive cars. The Zodiac's downfall was not a failure of reputation, but a consequence of Ford's structural transformation and an evolving market that no longer aligned with its philosophy. Today, its legacy is preserved by collectors, vintage rallies, and nostalgic motoring communities who remember it as one of Ford's boldest British icons.